verses 17 through 19, I've divided the life of Abraham into two. So again, we'll be looking at the subject of faith. We defined it in verses 1 through 3. And now we're looking at different illustrations of faith and what they lived through. Again, Hebrews 11, pick up in verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. I want to talk today about the times when our faith, maybe more our persons, are tested, and sometimes severely, and there seems to be no clear end in sight. In other words, for all you fixers, there is no fix. We are simply left with trusting God to get us through. Let me give you an illustration. I don't know, a month or more ago, we brought to you a prayer request about a couple that we're acquainted with in Rhinelander. They came home, found out that their 17-year-old boy, the last of the brood, they have 5 children, had committed suicide. Didn't fill you in on all the gory details. It's kind of an ugly scene, but he shot himself. So think about that and how they now have to live with that picture in their minds. I think about the fears that they may have now, like, will they ever get over the pain? Will they fall into the blame game? You know, there's 2 parents. If you could have just been a little softer, if you could have been a little this, a little more present, whatever. People get into the blame game. And so then they're wondering, okay, will their marriage stay together? Will there be a day when they can smile again? For them at this point, there is no end in sight whatsoever. All they have is God and the hope that He will pull them through. So when our faith is tested, the only thing there is to believe is that God will make a way. And by the way, that's the big idea. So if you want the big idea, it's just the outline. And the way may not be in this life. You notice the resurrection mentioned there. The way may not be in this life, but in the life to come. So let's look first at the testing of faith. We read in Genesis 22 that one day God came to Abraham and told him that he had to take Isaac to a mountain in the area of Moriah and offer him to God as a burnt offering. Several times for emphasis it says, your only son, or we could translate it, your unique son, because Isaac was the promise bearer. No promise unless Isaac stays alive somehow. And now he's about to be offered. We don't know for sure how old Isaac was. Abraham calls him a lad, but I don't think he was a little boy. Probably fully grown, young, maybe later 20s, teens. We just don't know. He was a young man. Several times earlier, God had spoken to Abraham, and each time his word was definite. And each time Abraham obeyed God, and this time is no different. He quickly made arrangements for the trip, and he left in the morning. Think about what might have been going through his mind. You know, the last time that God spoke to him was that he was going to have a son. He was 99 at the time. Sarah was 90. Now, he's going to have to sacrifice this son, and so God seems to be contradicting himself. You think about how crestfallen he might have been. You might think about how sick it made him feel. Is God really good? Is this a cruel joke? All of his feelings and questions were a part of the test. You do understand that when we go through all of that, that is a part of the test. However, none of this is recorded. Though Abraham was probably ripped apart, both out of love for Isaac and logically wondering how the promise will be fulfilled, he obeyed God. So you consider the test placed also before Isaac. He was not filled in. Abraham's just kind of filling him in as they go along. And he simply had to follow his dad until the last moment when he figured things out. My father did many building projects around our house as I was growing up. And so a Saturday would come along and he would say, I need your help today to do something. Okay, fine. So I'm thinking 1 or 2 hours. And he would never really give me the big picture so that I could scope it out and say, oh, this is going to take 1 or 2 days. So I'm thinking I'm off the hook within about an hour or two. Then he tells me the next thing that we're going to do. And then he tells me the next thing. And I go, oh, forget any plans for today. He just kind of strung us along. I know it wasn't deliberate, but, that's the way he did it. And it's kind of what's going on here. That Abraham is just bringing Isaac along, and little by little, he's putting the picture together. After 3 days' journey, Abraham leaves the other 2 men, and he and Isaac make their ascent up the mountain. Abraham says to the 2 that came with him, stay here. Me and the lad will worship and return to you. Interesting way of worshiping, isn't it? Isaac's mind, however, is rolling. So he says, Father, or he might have used the word daddy, we have everything for the sacrifice but the lamb. And Abraham assures him that God will provide. But it didn't look like it was going to be the case that day. Abraham placed his son on the altar, and he raised his knife to slay his son, and the obvious was going to happen. Hope you caught the tense there in Hebrews 11:17. It says that he offered his son. Not really, but it does put it in the past or the perfect tense. He offered him, because in Abraham's mind, he was already offered. He had given his son to God. Think about what that moment must have been like. Isaac did not fight back, but he must have fixed his eyes on Abraham's and in the absolute fear said, Daddy, what are you doing? What are you doing? When Connor was 8, and the illustration doesn't match up, but when Connor was 8, he had his appendix removed. I was at the Rotary golf outing. Pete Halverson then was our surgeon. He was sitting across from the table. I got a call from Alice and says, I think we're going to have to take Connor in. Pretty sure his appendix is going to need to be removed. So I looked at Pete and said, see you later. So I left, and then he left, and we met him there at the hospital. And Alice and I took Connor, into the prep room and all of that stuff, and were with him until, he was operated on. But when we looked at him, he was so afraid. He knew what was going on, and he's just so afraid. And I had to look at the fear in his eyes, and I said, no, son, it's going to be okay. It's okay. We prayed with him and held hands and then hugged him and so forth, and then they wheeled him away. How much more fear was Isaac feeling? The only way we might get it is to pretend to be Abraham and put one of our children on that altar. I know that's a morbid thought, isn't it? But if you do, you'll probably get what he was going through. So what goes through our minds when we are tested? So, God, if you are good, then you have a very strange way of showing it. Your ways seem cruel at best. Do you enjoy seeing your children suffer? It's then that our faith needs to kick in. You see, the same word for only son, monogenes, is the same word used for Christ in the Gospel of John. For God gave his only begotten, or only unique son. The parallels between Isaac and Christ are great. It says, figuratively speaking, it also is translated a type, which is a type, and it very well may be that Isaac is used as a type, Abraham also as his father looking upon Christ as he was upon the cross. So, what was going through the Godhead when Jesus was being offered up? One, God knows suffering. He suffered for you and for me. And he looked upon his son as he was dying on the cross. Think about Mary when she had to watch her son be tortured that way and then finally hung on a cross. I remember my friend's face when he found out his wife's cancer had returned. They thought they were free and clear, that they grow old together. I also remember, because I was with him every step of the way, and how he, by faith, went through the whole ordeal. I have a friend who has deteriorating disc disease. So he has a number of discs that are bad, but one is particularly bad. And before his last surgery, which, by the way, didn't really fix anything, it just kind of cleared it out so that he could actually walk and function, I was with him. And the pain was so great that, the scale, 1 to 10, just figure a 10, 10 plus. That's how bad it was. He was laying there, and he was just crying because the pain was so great. And he said to me, I wish it could just end. Heaven would be a happier place than here. But he made it. He got the surgery, and he's doing okay, I guess, okay. Wonders if the back will ever be well and how it's going to be in future years. I've walked with people who have suffered the unfaithfulness of a spouse or the death of a child. And what do? You think of God and his dying son. Though God's ways may not make sense and may seem contradictory, causing us to, even pass judgment on him, we have to trust that he knows our pain and will help us through it. That God somehow will make a way. We may not see the end, but he does. And we believe that he will get us through in this world and maybe in some cases the next. Remember the resurrection, which is the next point. It believes, that is faith, that God will make a way, verse 19. If we get back to the story, or go back to the story of Abraham, there are several hints that Abraham never really gave up hope. Abraham knows the miracle working of God. At 100, he had received a son named Isaac, which means laughter. I'm sure it refers to his and Sarah's laughter, but it's also God's laughter. Here's my blessing to you. He has witnessed a miracle. God said, is anything too hard for the Lord? So this same God would perform another miracle. The first hint, therefore, was when Abraham said, I and the lad will return to you, as he left the two at the base of the mountain. And the second hint was in his answer to Isaac. When he asked about the lamb, Abraham said, God will provide for himself a lamb. And just as Abraham was going to plunge the knife in Isaac's chest, God saved the day. The abbreviated form is that the angel of the Lord from heaven cried out, stop, stop. And they looked and they saw a ram caught in the thicket. And that ram was sacrificed as a substitute for Isaac. So Abraham called the place the Lord will provide. Abraham and Isaac came down from the mountain, as he said, and the family then moved on to Beersheba. The book of Hebrews tells us something more about Abraham's faith. He believed, that is Abraham, that God would raise Isaac from the dead if he were slain. Abraham thought it through. The NIV says, and he reasoned. My translation that I study from says, and he considered. It means to calculate, to compute, to think logically through it. So here's what he was thinking. He had been given a promise by God. God had miraculously enabled him and Sarah to have a boy, so the promise lives on. So if Isaac must be sacrificed, God is going to somehow make good on his promise. And the only solution is, therefore, if Isaac dies, God will have to raise him from the dead. Can you imagine thinking through that one? Took a lot of faith to think that one through. And it must have taken time to come to that conclusion. how many of us really believe in miracles? By miracles, I'm not necessarily talking about someone coming back from the dead. Okay, I know people who believe they can raise the dead. My friend's aunt died. Her husband and her were in ministry down in Florida, and they had a radio show forever called The News Behind the News. It was all about prophecy. And she died, and they were of the persuasion that, we'll just call on God and he'll perform a miracle. And so her husband, literally in the middle of the funeral, was going to go down there, lay hands on his wife, and raise her from the dead. And his sons held him back. Okay, no, Dad, please don't do this. Could it happen? Yeah, it's pretty unlikely. But I'm not really talking about that kind of miracle. By miracle, I'm not necessarily referring to a miraculous healing, though they happen. They happen. We just heard about one Saturday. It's fantastic, okay? By miracle in context, I mean God miraculously pulling us through the greatest ordeal of our lives. The time when everything comes crashing in on us and there seems to be no way out. At least that's the way it feels. But God has a way of making a way. He miraculously enables us by His grace to get us through the season we are in. Over time, much time, though, we are very different people. We find ourselves emerging into a new life, a life that is indeed blessed. Our friends up north can do nothing else but hope for that time. My friend, who was rising out of the ashes about 4 years ago after his wife died, has now a new life. For 2 years, he wore his wedding ring because he still loved his wife. Then the third year, we kind of noticed he wasn't wearing it anymore. Somebody had lined him up with a blind date. And they took it slow. It took about a year, getting to know each other and so forth. And now he's a happily married man. Would he have ever thought it? No. I called him up before his wedding, congratulated him, and I said, by the way, I'm watching. I said, you've been a good illustration. You've been a good illustration and you've done things right. And God has rewarded him. You think about people like Johnny Erickson, Tata, others who have been crippled by car accidents or, diagnosed with an incurable disease. They're not just looking for a season here. They're looking way beyond here. They're thinking to the resurrection and the time when they can have a new body. This is an old book. I read it, a couple of years ago, and I referred to it. I told you the story, and I said, well, someday we'll return to the ending of the book. So I'd like to do that this day. It's called A Grace Disguised. Anybody read it? I found it in the freebie pile here at church, and good book, though it's a painful book to read. The story is that a man and his wife, 4 children, and his mother, their grandmother, were in rural Idaho going to an Indian reservation and to watch a powwow. And when they left that evening, they were driving home on a lone highway, and coming toward them was a car. And the car swerved into their lane and hit them head on. It was a Native Indian or Native American who was drunk. His wife, who was pregnant, was drunk. She was killed, and the driver of that car killed both the man's wife, daughter, and mother. And so he got his other 3 children out of the car, and they're sitting there on this highway waiting, for somebody to come along and help them. By the way, his name is Jerry Sitzer, good writer. People wrote him many times and would ask him questions, and he said, one question keeps surfacing, and I'd like to just read it to you. One question keeps surfacing. Surprisingly, it is not theological, but a human, practical, and wrenching one. Will my life ever be good again? I am never sure how to respond. I could say no and tell the truth, as pessimistic as that sounds. Catastrophic loss is so devastating, its disruption so overwhelming, and its consequences so far-reaching that it seems improbable or impossible that we will ever experience the goodness of life again, if, that is, we equate goodness with what we once had wanted, a good marriage, for example, or healthy children, or meaningful work. Yet I can say, without a moment's hesitation, that my life has been very good since the accident occurred, 12 years, a long time. Since the accident occurred, though not as I had planned or imagined. How could so much good come out of something that was so unequivocally bad? Somewhere along the line, I realized I would have to change my idea of what the good life meant and promised. The old definition died on a lonely highway in rural Idaho back in 1991. The new definition has emerged so gradually and quietly that I am not sure I can make sense of it. For a long period of time, nothing in my life seemed good. The world seemed a bleak place to me. My future as dim as dusk on a gray winter's day. Somehow I had to believe that life would be good again when I had a little reason or evidence at my disposal. There is abundant evidence now. My life is as rich as any person I know, though it took a long time to get where I'm at. 3 changes come immediately to mind. The first is that I have changed inwardly. In the months following the accident, I spent many hours simply pondering my life, and I discovered much that was ugly. I saw selfishness, ambition, and impatience. I started to pray to the very God I hardly dared to trust, inviting him to do whatever was necessary to change my life. God simply used the stuff of ordinary life to expose my weakness and to develop my character. It just happened as slowly and surely as a tree grows. The second change has been my experience of being a father. I will never know how I would have functioned as a father had the accident not occurred. I was an active father before Linda, that's his wife, died, but nothing like I am now. I performed as a father then. I am a father now, deep inside. The third change has been the discovery that our lives are part of a greater story. What once seemed chaotic and random, like a deck of cards thrown into the air, has started to look like the plot of a wonderful story, which is God's story. It is not entirely clear yet how things will turn out, but I have lived this story long enough now to know that something extraordinary is unfolding, as if it were an epic that would give Homer a run for his money. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this time, and thank you for your love. We all go through stuff, and that's because this is a fallen world. May we ever love you and trust you. We pray in Jesus. Amen.